Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name's Richard Walsh, and I'm NQA's Principal Assessor with responsibilities for energy and environment. And just to make sure that we're all expecting what we're going to get this morning, we're going to be looking at ISO 14001. Which is a standard that's been around an awful long time now. We're still with the 2015 version, and obviously going back 6 or 7 years now, we did a lot of webinars, a lot of work on 14001 and the transition and what that relatively new standard meant. What we're going to do today is go back and have a look at the standard again, go through and look at what the clauses mean, and have a look at how we may have drifted perhaps sometimes, because we get lots and lots of questions about how things are applied, how things work, what was the intention of this particular clause, etc., etc. So we're going to have a little bit of a fresh look at what the clauses actually mean, and have a look at what we as assessors might expect to see. Couple of slides right at the start that I always sort of joke that I'm contractually obliged to show you. A little bit about who we are. This is from our marketing team. If you are new to NQA, we do operate in a number of places around the world, predominantly in the States. We have sites in India, China, and also a number of agencies around the world, including welcome, Mike. I see you joining us, particularly in South Africa. Basically, we can operate anywhere that you might feel that we need, and in fact, the orange dots on that slide do show you where we have operations in and around the world. As a certification body, of course, we specialise in management system certification, and you can see there the main areas that we operate in, and that's always growing, particularly for us at the moment, environment and areas around carbon neutrality, and towards the end we may just touch on where you might go having got to grips with 14001. Again, just a number of clients worldwide that we operate and work with, just to show the varying sectors in which we can work. And that's me. So I've been at NQA now for 15 years. And as I said earlier, I'm NQA's Principal Assessor in Environment and Energy. So what we're going to do is we're going to speak, or I'm going to speak for probably 45-50 minutes. I always tend to overrun, so apologise right from the start. If you have any questions, please ignore what it says on that slide. We've decided to slightly change the way that, not change the way we do the questions, but you should see on the screen, there should be like a window. And on that window, there should be a box that says questions. We used to say put them in the chat box, which is why it says on the slide there, put them in the chat box. But just having had a conversation before we started this webinar, if you put them in the question box, we can actually then pull those questions out, interrogate them, look for trends, look to see what sort of things people are asking. So if you have any questions as we're going along, type your questions in that question box. And we'll either answer them straight away if I feel it's appropriate to do and we haven't moved on from the topic, but there will be a section at the end where we can look at questions and go through anything that you might need some clarification on. To save you having to frantically scribble and write down, there will be a recording of the webinar. So every webinar we do is circulated, and there'll be a link to that. It's on our YouTube channel. If you're familiar with YouTube, search for NQA. It'll take you to our channel, and there are recordings of all the webinars we do, not just on environment and energy, but on a whole range of topics: health and safety, quality, information security, etc., etc. There's loads and loads of webinars, really worth watching some of them. And you'll also get a copy of the slides. We will circulate a PDF copy of the slides that I'm going to show now. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do in this next hour or so that you've given up of your hard-earned time? We're going to have a look at 14,000. We'll go right back to basics, as the name of the webinar suggests. We're going to look at the key overarching concepts. What's the standard all about? What's it trying to achieve? A reminder of the structure. So how's it put together? We're going to have a fresh look at the clauses, and that's the main part of what we'll be doing this morning or this afternoon, depends where you are. And then maybe have a little chat towards the end about 14,001 itself. Is it a destination? So is it the end of the line, or is 14,001 maybe a stepping stone that might then allow us to build upon that and maybe look at some other areas that might be relevant to us? And of course, questions. So don't forget, any questions that crop up as we're going through, type them into the question box and we'll deal with them either straight away or towards the end. Right, let me just have a quick look. Somebody's... Yeah, okay, thanks, Naomi. I'll have a look at that about zero carbon legislation. We'll maybe just have a quick chat about that towards the end. Okay, so that's the learning objective. So starting out, why have we got a standard on environmental management? What's it all about? So right back to the very basics. So the whole idea of the standard, and this standard's been around since 1996 in various iterations. Published in 1996, following on from a British standard, which was BS 7750, revised in 2004, and then revised again in 2015. And we're not far away from thinking about, does the standard need revising again? Because obviously this standard is a 2015 standard, and it's been around now for 7 years. Doesn't seem like it, but it has. So it's to provide organisations with a framework, give them a structured mechanism by which businesses, any organisation, can protect the environment and respond to changing environmental conditions. So it provides this systematic approach, protecting the environment by preventing or mitigating adverse environmental impacts. So what we might be doing, it helps us think about how we as a business or we as an organisation have an impact on the environment. What are we doing? How can we improve on that? How can we mitigate any negative effects we're having? It also helps an organisation fulfil compliance obligations. Certainly here in the UK, there's a raft of environmental legislation, and the standard helps us sort through that, helps us decide which pieces of legislation are relevant to us, although the standard uses the term compliance obligations now. Which bits are relevant to us? Which bits do we have to comply with? And then how do we comply with them? How do we build that into our operations to make sure that we're doing what we should be doing? Ultimately, it's about enhancing our environmental performance, improving the way we have an impact on the environment, and then controlling or influencing the way that an organisation's products and services are designed, manufactured, distributed, consumed and disposed of. So this 2015 version of the standard asks us to take a life cycle approach to our operations. It's not asking for a full life cycle assessment, but it asks us to have this consideration about what's happening upstream of our operations. So where are we buying things from? How are those products produced? Right the way through to the end of life, if you like, of our products. If we're producing a product, how are those products disposed of? Are they easily disposed of, etc., etc. So it's not just about what we might do within our own boundaries. So there's a couple of overarching contexts, outcomes. So I was just reading another question that had come through, which we'll come back to, I think, at the time. It's quite a long question, Sean, so we'll park that one to the end, and we'll come back to it, I do promise. So the standard has a couple of three intended outcomes, which we'll keep coming back to. And this is stated at the beginning of the standards. So the three main expectations that we have as assessors when we come in to audit any organisation are that the standard is working to enhance the organisation's environmental performance. That's got to be the bottom line. There's got to be a fulfilment of compliance obligations. Now, compliance obligations is the term that's now used for legal and other requirements. Some of those standards, rather annoyingly, some of the other standards rather still use that term. ISO 50001, the energy standard, still uses the term legal and other requirements. Compliance obligations are anything that we are expected to comply with, be it a piece of legislation or be it maybe a customer requirement. And then achievement of environmental objectives. The only way that you will improve is to set yourself environmental objectives. And we'll look to see what those objectives are. Are they realistic? Are they suited to the organisation? And most importantly, are you achieving them? The standard also, all of the standards now also focus on the management of change. The 2015 standards, so there was a couple, obviously there was 9,001, there was 14,001, you've then got 45,001 for health and safety, 50,001 for energy management, and several others now. They all focus on the planning process. The standards are much more proactive rather than being reactive. So there's a lot of effort put in the standards, and a lot of effort required on planning to do things, not just things happening. So included within that is the management of risk, and risk, as we'll see, can be positive or negative. The standard also calls a positive risk an opportunity, and the standards deliberately are now designed so they can be integrated with all the other standards. They're all more or less in the same format. A couple of definitions that I always like to talk about because these can cause some issues on some of the assessments that I've been involved in. So the standard uses a few words that I just want to clarify. So where the standard uses the word consider, that actually means you have to think about it. You have to consider it, as the word suggests. You have to think about the topic, but it can be excluded. If the standard uses the phrase take into account, that's very similar to consider. You have to think about the topic, but then you have to do something with it. You have to take that into account. You have to do something. So if the standard says something around maybe aspects and says you have to take into account significant aspects, then you can't ignore them. And we'll look at that shortly. The other one, which is a big thing of mine, is the difference between the two words continual and continuous. I see so many policies particularly that refer to the phrase continuous improvement. You will not see the word continuous in the standard. The standard uses the word continual, and the two words are not interchangeable. As it says there, continual duration occurs over a period of time. So you're not improving all of the time. Yes, the direction of travel is still upwards. The analogy I like to use is a set of stairs or a ramp. So continual is a set of stairs where we might be climbing the stairs a step at a time, and we might get halfway up the stairs and then there's a landing. So we pause there a little bit and then we continue onwards. That's continual, and that's quite what the standard intends. Continuous is a ramp. It's improvement without interruption. And that's not what you mean. So those of you that use the word continuous in your policy, you are making a claim that you probably don't intend to keep. Right, very quickly, the standard itself. This is a slide, it's quite interesting. It's a slide that I put together several years ago now, probably 2014, when we were looking at the draft versions of the new standard. And I've seen this pinched, I've seen this slide appear in lots and lots of other people's presentations. It shows the standard, how it fits in with the Deming cycle, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. and it shows the auditable clauses. Clauses 1, 2, and 3 are not clauses that we would audit when we come in to do an assessment. We look at clauses 4 to 10, and 4 to 7 are the planning clauses, 8 is the doing, 9 is checking, and 10 is acting. Now, something that hit me a year or two ago now, and if you've been on any of my other presentations, you might have heard me say this, so I apologise. You can sort of categorize the clauses. So the even clauses, so 4, 6, 8, and 10 are where you actually have to do something happens. The odd numbered clauses facilitate the movement between the even numbered clauses. So to give an example, so clause 4, context of the organisation, that's about who we are, where we sit, what's important to us, what are the expectations of other people that might have an interest in our business, what's the scope of our management system, and then setting up the system itself. So we've got to do something there. But in order to then move all of that forward, we need some resources. What do we need? We need some leadership. We need a policy behind which we can operate, and we need to set out some roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Having those 3 things in place allow us to move to clause 6, which is where we start to plan to do things. So we plan to address our risks and opportunities, we set ourselves some objectives, and we start to plan to make the changes. However, in order to get to clause 8, which is the operational bit where we put those plans into operation, what do we need? We need some resources, we need some competent people, we need to have awareness, we need our staff to be aware of what we're doing, we need to communicate, and we might need some documented information. We then get to the clause 8, which is where we do something, we set out operational controls, we make sure that we're doing what we need to do in a responsible way. Clause 9, we need to check what we're doing. Are we doing what we needed to do? How effective is it? So that's helping us move on to find the areas where we need to improve. And then clause 10 is improvement. So 4, 6, 8, and 10 is where we do things, and 5, 7, and 9 are the facilitation clauses that move us in between the even numbered clauses. So let's have a look at some of those clauses and where are we going? So let's start at clause 4. Clause 4 is the first of the auditable clauses. So context of the organisation. Who are we? What are we doing? What's important to us? So we need to think about those internal and external issues. We need to think about the needs and expectations of interested parties. Who's interested in what we do? Who has a relevant interest? We set the scope. We're going to look at these in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. We need to decide what are the boundaries of our management system. And we can't use the scope to exclude activities, products, and services that can have significant environmental aspects. So we can't say, oh, I'm not too sure about that operation down at the bottom end of the yard. Tell you what, we'll exclude that. We can't do that. You can't use the scope to remove significant issues from your management system. And obviously the scope's then available as a documented information, and people need to be aware of what the scope of our system actually covers. So what do we mean by context? This is not about what we put up the chimney, what we put down the drain, what we put in our skips. This is a higher level understanding of where we sit as an organisation and what are the internal and external issues. What are they? The issues that are going to help us achieve the expected outcome. Now, if you remember, the main expected outcome was the improvement in environmental performance. The way I talk about this is there are things out there, there are things in the world out there in the real world, there are things that are going to help us achieve that, and there are things that are going to get in the way. And we'll look at that on the next slide. But we need to think about those, and I'll show you how that moves us forward into another clause later on. And the standard itself asks us to make that link, and interestingly, it's a link I see not there. In fact, I was auditing a client yesterday, and they'd missed that link between this clause and clause 6, and we'll look at that shortly. So clause 4.1 requires us to consider our context. Where do we sit? What is it that's important to us, both internally and externally? So internally, our own staff, our own operations, maybe our own shareholders and things like that, and interested parties, stakeholder concerns. So thinking about those two together with the stakeholders, thinking about the context of where we are, that should help us make sure that our management system focuses on the things that present the greatest risk. Remember, the standard says that risk can be positive or negative in achieving environmental improvement. I think this particular clause and clause 6.1.1, which we'll look at shortly, are the two clauses that seem to be misunderstood the most. And if you get these clauses right, you go a long way to working out the way in which you need to improve your environmental performance. So, from context then, as I've said, context is about identifying the things that will help us achieve the intended outcome, and also identifying the things that are going to get in the way of what we're trying to do. So the things that will help us become our opportunities in clause 6.1.1. The things that get in the way become the risks. And then we have to, in clause 6.1.1, decide how we're going to address the risks and make sure we grasp the opportunities that we've identified. And if you read clause 6.1.1 of the standard, it directs you immediately back to clause 4.1 and 4.2 and says that you have to take into account the issues that were raised at this clause. And a lot of people seem to miss the linkage between clause 4.1 and 4.2 and clause 6.1.1. Just to give you a quick idea of the sort of things that we're thinking about. And there's various ways. The standard doesn't tell you how to do this. A lot of people will maybe use a pestle analysis, something like that, to help them. I tend to look at things in 3 areas. We think about environmental conditions, we think about external issues, we think about internal issues. But ultimately, the intent of this clause is to provide a high-level understanding of the things that can positively or negatively affect the way in which we manage our environmental responsibilities. So those are the sorts of things we need to think. It's high level. It's what's going on in the world. It's what's going on with the economy. So obviously at the moment, a lot of the drivers, particularly around energy, as you can imagine, are price related. And that's been, not that I'm advocating high energy prices, but it's been a huge driver in making the returns on investment a lot more understandable, a lot easier, if you like, because suddenly energy prices are so high that the return on investment for making some improvements suddenly makes it much more cost effective. So we talked about interested parties. We need to work out who they are. What do they require of us? So they may be customers, they may be the people that live across the road from where we operate, they could be our shareholders, they could be our staff. We have to identify who they are and what is it that they're interested in. And as an absolute minimum, we have to take into account all legal requirements. And then we talk about, the standard talks about voluntary arrangements. So we talk about things that people may ask of us and things that we've agreed to do. I remember a client that I worked with some years ago. There was a haulage company and they were down a small country lane and they had to drive past 3 or 4 houses. The people in the houses didn't particularly like vehicles, very heavy lorries driving past at all hours of the night. So the company and the residents came to an informal agreement whereby, unless there was exceptional circumstances, there would be no vehicle movements after, I think it was 10 o'clock at night and before 7 in the morning. Whilst it was an informal agreement, it still became what the standard calls a compliance obligation. And a voluntary arrangement like that becomes an obligation when it's been agreed and adopted. So, a couple of questions. With interested parties, this is one from Edward, with interested parties such as suppliers, do we need to consider where the suppliers get their materials, such as wood or rare metals? I'm going to come back to that, Edward, because actually the standard tells us that. The standard tells us what we need to consider when we come on to looking at aspects. So I am going to park that one, and we will answer that. And the standard does answer that question for you when we get to it. I'm going to come back to legal requirements, Richard, because there is a section on legislation within this. And what else have we got? We'll leave that. So, Edward, I've answered your question partly, and Richard will look at legal requirements shortly. So, the scope of the EMS, that's the next part of this initial clause 4. Clarifies the physical and organisational boundaries of our management system. It can be the whole of the organisation, or you can certify part of the organisation, and that does happen. We have a number of clients where they haven't certified the entire organisation. However, you have to be very clear in the wording of the scope, what's included, and you cannot use a partial scope to give the impression that you've certified the whole organisation. So the scope mustn't be misleading, and it must be documented and made available to interested parties. It's one of the discussions we have right at the start of anybody coming to work with us, anybody coming along and applying to do 14,001. They set out the wording of the scope, what's going to be included. And we have quite a discussion about if there are exclusions to the scope, what they are and why they're being excluded. But I think the phrase must not be misleading is very key to that one. And then finally, the last bit, you've got to implement, establish, implement and maintain, and importantly, continually improve the management system to achieve the intended outcomes. It's another bit that gets forgotten about sometimes. Yes, you're continually improving your environmental performance, but you're also improving your management system. I'll probably give you a little bit of a heads up. We are going to overrun because it's 11:30 now here in the UK, and we're only about a third of the way through the slides. So we probably are going to overrun by about 10 minutes towards the end. So I do apologise now, but I want to get this right, and I want to make sure that we understand what we're doing. So leadership, this is within the 2015 standard. It was a new clause. The previous standards talked about senior management commitment. But as part of this move to being much more proactive, we now get this term leadership. And obviously, you can read what's on the slide there. That's basically taken from the standard itself. But it's all about making sure that the EMS isn't managed in isolation. I remember the days, as I say, I've been at NQA 15 years. In the very early days, you would turn up on site and say, I'm here to audit your environmental management system. And the answer you would get is, yeah, you want Fred, he's down the corridor, first door on the left. He'll look after you. He's our environmental manager. We don't know what he does, but he keeps us all out of jail. And that's how it used to be. The whole idea now is that any of these management systems, quality, environment, health and safety, energy, information security, they are integral to the way the business operates. They're not to be managed in isolation, managed separately from the core strategy of the business. So if the business, for instance, is thinking about expanding, if the business is thinking about building a new set of premises or expanding its existing set of premises, the environmental system, the health and safety system, the energy system, all need to be considered when those strategic business decisions are being made. All too often, I speak to managers of environment, managers of energy, who will say, by the time I got involved, all the important decisions had been made. And that's not how it's meant to be. The standards need to be used at the beginning, at the start of those strategic business decisions being made. The standard itself, the environmental standard, the health and safety standard, all of these standards need to be aligned with the business objectives. So the business objectives, it's no good rushing out and doing things and saying our main objectives are going to be something that's going to hugely damage the environment. The objectives need to be tempered by the environmental management system to make sure that, yes, that expansion might take place, but it's done in a responsible way. Leadership's about making sure that the standard, the system rather, benefits from an appropriate level of resources. That's actually clause 7.1, but I've moved it into leadership because generally the resources come from the people at the top. So we need to make sure, we need to see evidence that the system, the environmental requirements, the performance improvements are being adequately resourced, and that there is appropriate involvement from across the business. Are the design team involved? Are the maintenance team involved? Are the production guys involved? Everybody needs to have an involvement in this if we're going to achieve the expected outcomes. And we want to see the standard providing real value. It's not just about having a badge on the wall, having a flag that we can fly to say, hi guys, we've all got 14,001. Isn't that wonderful? It's got to provide real value to the organisation and provide that real improvement. And again, leadership has to make sure that the standard, the system continually improves and remains successful. Top management, defined by the standard as the person or group of people who directs and controls an organisation at the highest level. And that's within the scope of the system. So in an organisation with a company-wide EMS, we're talking about the board. The managing director, the president, call them what you will, it's the people who are at the highest level. Interestingly, we have this on a number of occasions. If an EMS has been adopted by a business unit within a larger organisation, then the top management would be the senior management of the business unit, not the top management of somebody who's sat in a head office, maybe in London or Washington or wherever they might be working. It's the senior management in that business unit. And of course, the standard requires, we call it the new standard, obviously say it's 7 years old now, requires top management ultimately to take accountability for the effectiveness of the system. Yes, you have to have a policy. The policy has to be appropriate to your purpose and context. It's to be appropriate to the nature, scale and environmental impact of whatever it is you're doing. And it sets the framework for environmental objectives. This policy has to make 4 basic commitments, and you would be amazed the number of times I visit clients and the policies do not make these 4 commitments. I don't like auditing as a tick box exercise, but for policy it is. I need to see a policy making these 4 commitments, that the organisation commits to protecting the environment, that the organisation commits to fulfilling their compliance obligations. You can refer to them as legal and other requirements. That's an option. That's what the old standard used to call them. And it's still allowable to use that term if you're more comfortable with that. There has to be a commitment to the setting of environmental objectives and targets. Now, I actually prefer to actually see the phrase setting and achievement of environmental objectives and targets, because obviously that's a key outcome of the system. And then finally, this is the one that gets missed most often, a commitment to continually improve the EMS, the management system, in order to enhance environmental performance. Those 4 commitments have to be in the policy. And the policy commitment has to be the protection of the environment. That's one of the main policy commitments. And it includes prevention of pollution and other things, but specific to the context of your organisation. Talks about sustainable resource use, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, protection of biodiversity ecosystems, etc., etc. One of the issues I have a little bit, and this has sort of been acknowledged now in a UK government consultation process. 14,001, yes, looks at energy and is very clear that we need to be sourcing energy from a responsible source. That's all about protecting the environment. I have clients with 14,001 and with 50,001. 50,001 2018 is all about the amount of energy you use, and it doesn't care where that energy has come from. It's all about kilowatt hours of energy. And there are times when 14,001 and 50,001 can clash slightly. So for instance, in order to meet some environmental objectives, you might decide as a business to install some solar panels on the roof, solar PV. That would help in terms of carbon reduction. 50,001 clearly states in the annex that that is not an energy performance improvement because you're still using the same amount of energy. So there is a little bit of a clash sometimes between 14 and 50,001. And this has been recognised by the UK government, and they have just very recently published the results of a consultation process about how 50,001 can be used to not only improve energy performance, but also to improve the environmental side of where that energy is coming from. And I'm happy to talk about that at some other time. We haven't time to cover that today. We need to set roles and responsibilities. So for people, people need to know what's expected of them. People need to know what authorizations, what level of authority they've got. So in order, as you remember, we're in clause 5, so we're in a clause that's actually facilitating our movement from one of the clauses to another clause. So we need to understand what is expected of our staff. We need to be able to delegate responsibility. We need to set authorities for key roles within our management system. They need to be assigned, they need to be communicated. And interestingly, none of the standards now, none of these new standards require a management representative. Interesting concept, because for years and years we had quality managers, we had environmental managers, we had energy managers. And in fact, 50,001 did formally require an energy manager and set the criteria for the not quite the the competency of that energy management. That's all changed. And the reason it's changed is to do away with situations like I spoke about 5-10 minutes ago, where you turn up and you go, I'm here to look at your energy, your environmental management system. You want Freddie's down the corridor, it's his job. It's to make sure that as a business, as an organisation, we understand that energy improvements, environmental improvements, health and safety improvements are everybody's responsibility. To be fair, most organisations I work with still have an environmental manager, but the standard does not require it. There is no formal requirement for a management representative. Interestingly, 50,001 does require an energy performance team or an energy management team, and gives some indication as to the makeup of that team. 14,001 doesn't require that, but it's quite a good idea to have some form of collective group who will look at environmental management. However, there are 2 key roles that have to be allocated to either a group of people or an individual, but ultimately come back to the responsibility of the top management. Ensuring that the system conforms to the requirements of the standard, and then reporting on performance of the system and also of environmental performance back to top management, and that's normally done through the management review. And then also there has to be a responsibility for providing resources. Right, we now on to another doing clause, clause 6, planning. So ultimately this clause is all about making sure that as an organisation we are achieving continual improvement in our environmental performance. That's the bottom line. That's why that is at the bottom. So it's all about achieving our intended outcomes. And we said right at the start, enhanced environmental performance, fulfillment of compliance obligations, and achieving our environmental objectives. And the start of clause 6, the start of the planning clause, is about preventing or reducing undesired effects. So it's about thinking about our significant environmental impacts, and there's a section on aspects and impacts, but also, this is the bit that I mentioned earlier that gets forgotten sometimes, thinking about the environmental conditions, the context, going back to clause 4.1, that will affect our organisation. So clause 6.1.1, prioritise issues with potential adverse or beneficial effects. And this, as I say, quite often gets missed. You mention risks and opportunities, and the first thing people show you is the aspect register, and that's something completely different. We do think about environmental aspects, but there's a separate clause for that. We do think about compliance obligations, and there's a separate clause for that. The main crux of this little clause is to think back to clauses 4.1 and 4.2, context and interested parties, to think about these issues with adverse and beneficial effects on the organisation. Think about that little flow chart, things that are going to help us, things that are going to get in the way. We need to grasp the opportunities presented and mitigate the risks, mitigate the negatives. And this link between 6.1.1 and 4.1 and 4.2 very, very often gets missed. And we prioritise them based on the achievement of the intended outcome. Are they going to help us achieve improvements in environmental performance? Are they going to help us prevent adverse effects? And are they ultimately going to help us achieve continual improvement? So environmental aspects, not the same as risks and opportunities, although they do provide risks, but environmental aspects are about, as a business, as an organisation, what do we do that produces a change somewhere in the environment, whether it's positive or negative. So, environmental aspects of activities, products or services that it can control and influence and their associated environmental impacts. So, right, I'm going to go back now. Cracky, where are we? It's a few questions ago now. I'm going to go back to the question that Edward put forward. With interested parties such as suppliers, do we need to consider where the suppliers get their materials such as wood or rare metals from? I've told you that the standard tells you this, and it does. You read clause 6.1.2. It talks about using a life cycle perspective, but it says you only have to take into account, you only have to think about and act on things that you can control or influence. So, Edward, can you control or influence where your suppliers get their material from? I don't know the answer to that. You need to think about that. If you can control or influence it, you need to take it into account. If you can't control or influence it, forget it. What you could do is change suppliers to move to a supplier that will allow you to have that conversation and maybe have a bit of influence, but the standard does not require you to manage your suppliers and where they get their information, where they get their materials from. I hope that's answered the question for you, Edward. However, so the standard says we have to take into account, so we have to think about it and act on it, any changes, new or modified activities, products and services, planned or new developments. So therefore, the aspects register has to be a living, breathing document. It's not something that we do as a once in a lifetime activity. Remember, I said right at the start, I was talking about businesses that were making developments and the environmental manager would sue. By the time I found out about it, it was too late. This is where planned or new development should be thought about. So one of the requirements, certainly in the UK, for large developments is that there is some sort of environmental impact assessment done. All an environmental impact assessment is a theoretical aspects and impacts register. If we build it like this, what's the environmental impact going to be? So use the aspects register to help plan new developments. Because by the time it's been built, it's too late to make any changes. So that bit about planned or new developments, I think, is quite an interesting concept and another concept that people miss when they're thinking about aspects and impacts. We need to think about abnormal, so things that don't normally happen, things that might happen only occasionally, and also reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. What might happen if that tank leaks? What might happen if that pipe fails? How are we going to control that? How are we going to work out it's happened? And how are we going to respond to that? We need to think about adverse impacts and also beneficial impacts. And it's another area where I see, so I may be going to a business and they'll be very proudly showing me areas of the site that they've turned over to wildflower meadows. They're trying to improve biodiversity. There are bug houses, there are bat boxes, there are bird boxes around. That's fine. But you don't see any of that in the environmental aspect. There are positive aspects. Take advantage of that. So the standard is not asking us to just consider the negative, it's asking us to look at the positive and make sure that the positives are as positive as we can make them. Aspects that needs to be communicated internally, so people need to be aware of what they are, but ultimately we need to think about this life cycle perspective, but it's only on things we can control or influence. And that, I think, is the key to Edward's question from earlier. Compliance obligations, another question that we had about. So an acceptable term is still legal under the requirements. So in other words, what is it that's been expected of us? What do we have to comply with? Determine what they are, and then determine how they apply to the organisation. Now, there was another question from Richard about how do you determine what are the relevant legal requirements? Now, that's a $64,000 question. Unless you're an expert in legislation, I accept it's quite difficult. There are a number of organisations that provide that either as a sort of a service that you can log on to and you can access environmental legislation. There are organisations that will do that for you. I'm not going to mention, well, I'll mention a few, but I'm not going to particularly talk about any that are better than any others. It's not our job to recommend. There are people like the compliance people, they used to be called Newground, they're now called the compliance people. They will offer a service where you can actually put into their website, it's a subscription service, of course. You'll put in what your activities are, what your significant aspects are, and that will help you then decide what is the relevant legislation across all the different areas, and will also keep you updated when the legislation changes. There are people like Kroner's, Barber Index. They all do very, very similar things. So there is lots and lots of help out there. And if I'm honest, it's the one area where most organisations I see that still use a consultant tend to use a consultant in this area, both for identifying the legislation and also, which we'll see shortly, the evaluating compliance. Are we complying with the legislation? Are we doing what's asked of us, or are we not doing what we're not supposed to do? And that is under clause 9, that is something we have to think about. There isn't an easy answer, Richard, in how do you determine what the relevant legal requirements are. So that's about the best I can give you, but there is lots and lots of help out there. Right, moving on. The standard does allow risk management. So in other words, you prioritize things on the basis of risk, and that's what we talked about in clause 611, identification of risk. However, you cannot apply risk management principles to legislation. So in other words, you cannot say, we'll accept a risk of non-compliance. And in a way, this is where, if you're in the UK, you'll probably have seen this all over the news. The water companies have been criticised, in my view, quite rightly, for accepting the risk of non-compliance. They accept that there are times when they will have to release raw sewage into either rivers, streams, or even onto the beach. And they accept that. Now, to me, that is unacceptable. They're accepting a risk of non-compliance. And I get very, very frustrated when I see water companies doing that, yet those water companies have ISO 14001. And I would always wish to question their certification bodies and say, how are you allowing that risk of non-compliance in a 14001 system? Because the standard prohibits that. But that's I guess between them and their certification body, and I don't work with any water companies, so I can express a view, but there's not a lot I can do to change that. Obviously, planning action. So having identified what our aspects are, having identified what the significant aspects are, what the compliance obligations are, what the risks are, what are we going to do to try and address all of those, to mitigate the negatives, to accentuate the positives? And this is about the standard, as I said earlier, the standard being much more proactive. How are we going to improve? And then this section 614 is all about how we are going to plan to take action, not the actions themselves, but how are we going to plan to think about what are we going to do to improve. The way we then improve and the results of that planning action, the results of that planning section are ultimately the objectives. Now, it used to talk about objectives and targets. The energy management system still talks about planning, objectives and targets. But in 14,001, the term target has been removed, and it talks about now objectives and planning to achieve them. I still see people that use the term target, and I'm not bothered, but the standard doesn't use that term anymore. So objectives must be consistent with policy commitments, measurable if practicable, monitored, communicated, and updated. And then for each objective, there needs to be planned actions. Who does what and when do they do it? What resources do we need? How are we going to evaluate the results to make sure that we have achieved them, and the objectives need to be integrated into the business processes. One of the things I see often are objectives that are not objectives. I've lost count of the times I've seen, for instance, an objective that says we will remain legally compliant. That's not an objective. That's a formal requirement of the standard. At the other end of the scale, I'll see an objective that will say replace all our lights with LED lights. So we'll get rid of all the fluorescent lights and we'll fit LED lights in the warehouse. That's not an objective. The objective is to improve the energy performance of our lighting by, and it doesn't ask for a target, but measurable, improve the performance of our lighting in the warehouse by 25%. How are we going to do it? Is the installation of LED lighting. So that is a planned action, installing LED lighting. That is not the objective. The objective is what are we trying to achieve, and then the installation of the lighting is how we're going to achieve that. And again, bear in mind those two sort of extremes when we think about setting of objectives. I'm going to skip through these pretty quickly because you can read these slides. There's not been much change from historical standards here. Competency. It's not just about training people, it's about making sure that people are competent to do what we're asking of them. It's up to us to decide what competence is required. We need to set competency levels to make sure that the people that we're asking to do jobs are competent to carry out those jobs, carry out those roles we're giving them on the basis of education, training, or experience. It's not just about sending everybody in a training course. People can be deemed competent by their experience. And if we're asking somebody to do a job and we feel there is a gap in their competence, we will then be expected to take action to allow them to acquire that competency, which might be training, it might be mentoring, it might be reassignment, or it might be the use of additional staff or employing a consultant to come and work alongside them for a bit. There's all sorts of different methods, but we need to maintain competency records. The standard requires that people doing work under our control, including contractors, are aware of the policy and its commitments, the aspects and impacts of their work, how they can contribute to the effectiveness of the system, and the implications of not conforming. And an area that quite often gets missed is contractors. If you've got people coming onto your site to do some work, they might be coming on site to do some decorating, some painting, they might be coming on site to fit out some new office furnishings, they might be coming on site to maintain a piece of machinery. They all need to have been through some degree of awareness training. I'll use the word training, but more like an induction that covers those areas. And as assessors, we will, if we see in people on site during an assessment, we quite often will walk over to them and ask them about what do they know about your business? What do they know about what you're expecting of them? What do they know about the environmental rules and regulations? It might be as simple as telling them that they pack all the waste up with them and take it away from site rather than putting it in your skip. Might be as simple as that. but they need to be set parameters under which they can work to make sure that they're not working against, inadvertently, your environmental operations, your environmental targets. Communication, obviously, we need to communicate, and there's another linkage here. So in clause 4.2, which was about the needs of interested parties, quite often those needs from an interested party are about information, they are about communication. What do we need to tell them? What do we need to show them? So the needs of interested parties in 4.2 links through to clause 7.4 communication. So we take those needs, we take those requirements that we've identified, and we work out how we're going to fulfill them. How do we need to tell them what they need to know? What communication channels do we need to know? So that's a fairly key link as well within the standard. I apologise that I'm going well over time, and I understand if you wish to leave, feel free. As I say, you will get a recording of this that you can catch up on the bits that you might have missed. So we are going to be significantly over, at least by 10-15 minutes now, but I do apologise, but I think it's been worthwhile. So we need to think about how we communicate within our organisation and also communicate externally as well. And again, just a little bit of a slide here that talks about the sorts of things that we might expect to have to communicate. And I've just put that into a little bit of a table for you to give you a little bit of an idea about what the standard says you're expected to communicate. So that's just a little bit of a cheat sheet, if you like, on helping you comply with the standard. Documented information, another clause of the standard. Remember, we're not talking about a complex document control system. It's not going back to the old days of BS 5750, the early days of ISO 9001, where we had complex document control systems that took a whole team of people to manage them. It's not really about that. The standard says we have to create and maintain sufficient documented information in a manner to demonstrate a suitable, adequate and effective EMS. So it's all about implementing the system, making sure the system's providing what we want, and then making sure we have the appropriate level of documentation at the point that we need that documentation. Doesn't have to be in the form of a manual. You don't have to have an environmental manual. A lot of people still do, but you don't have to have one. But whatever documentation you have has to be controlled, available and protected. And the word protected is in there because increasingly, obviously, we're seeing people with electronic documentation. Right, the sad individual that I am, I've been through the standard and listed out everywhere that the standard says we need to retain documented information. Now, the standard uses the term documented information. It doesn't use the term documents and records. That was like the old standard. But I've kept that because I think we understand better what a document is and what a record is. So a document tends to provide information, whereas a record obviously records something. It records the results of something. So again, a cheat sheet. Every single clause that says there has to be documented information retained is listed in there. And if you can go through your system and tick off all of those areas, you'll have gone a long way to meeting the requirements of the standard in terms of retention of documented information. Clause 8 is an interesting one. This is basically where we now start to put into practice, put into operation the things that we said we were going to do. So where we're going to improve an operation, where we're going to control an operation to make sure that it's providing an environmental improvement, this is where we do that. This is where we set out the process control. So it's about making sure that we have processes that meet the requirements of the standard, and we implement the planned actions going right the way back to clauses 6.1 and 6.2, which was around aspects, around risk and opportunities. So we have to make sure that we're in control of our significant environmental aspects. So whatever we've decided, if we've decided that our segregation of waste is a specific key environmental aspect, significant aspect, we need a process to make sure that we are segregating the waste, we're separating it out, we're not mixing hazardous waste with non-hazardous waste, etc., etc. And there might be some sort of operational control documentation. It might be a flow chart. One of my clients has gone down the road of actually having photographs. So above each bin, there are photographs. This is what you can put in the bin. This is what you can't put in the bin. And that works really, really well. So that's all part of operational planning and control, so that we're controlling our significant aspects. We're controlling our compliance obligations. We're making sure that we're not putting stuff down the drain that we're not allowed to do. It also includes our objectives. We might have set an objective to improve our energy performance. How are we going to do that? How are we going to manage our operations to make sure that we're running them at the ideal energy sort of situation? So, for instance, if it's an oven, maybe an oven that heat treats something or bakes something or whatever, how do we manage the setting of the temperature? So are there, if it's an oven for baking, are there recipes that tell us exactly what we set the oven at, exactly how long the temperatures is maintained for, just to make sure that people understand what it is they're supposed to be doing? And the other interesting little bit is about outsourced processes and how we control and manage outsourced processes. And again, there's a whole debate about what is an outsourced process, which we haven't really got time to cover here. But again, I can sort of talk about that at some other time if people wanted to ask me about that. But we also need to make sure that we're setting the parameters for how outsourced processes operate. Yes, we talk about life cycle perspective, and if you remember, we talked about the standards saying that we only have to be able to control or influence things, but it's about making sure that we set up and we establish controls in our design and development to ensure that we're thinking about the life cycle of our product. How does our product get used? How does our product get disposed of at the end of its life cycle? And thinking back up the supply chain, going as far back as we can control or influence, how is our raw material obtained? How are our raw materials manufactured? What level of control or influence do we have or can we have over our suppliers? Communicate relevant requirements to external providers. So we might say to our suppliers, we want you to use packaging that is returnable. So this is how we might get customer compliance obligations. So compliance obligations are not just legislation. We might get things from our customers. So we may say to our key suppliers, we don't want everything sent in throwaway plastic trays. We'd like you to now use returnable packaging. One of the organisations I work with supplies vegetables to Tesco's. If you shop in Tesco's, you will see virtually all the vegetables on the shelf are in green plastic trays. They're actually, the supplier puts the vegetables in there, they're packaged onto a pallet, they put on the shelf in Tesco's. When they're empty, Tesco's take them back, collapse them and send them back. So there is no disposable packaging in, and that is a relationship that Tesco's have developed with their produce suppliers. If the produce suppliers didn't want to do that, then they wouldn't be supplying to Tesco's, and that is a customer compliance obligation. If you're going to supply us, you'll use this type of packaging. We need to make sure that we're using documentation. Do we need flowcharts? Do we need instructions to make sure that what we're doing is effective? And also, as we say, part of this lifestyle, think about transport, delivery, use, and end-of-life treatment. Little bit on emergency preparedness. Things go wrong within the best, even in the best planned operations, things can and do go wrong. So we need to think about how we respond to emergency situations. It might be a tank that leaks, it might be a pipe that gets fractured, it might be an accident that something happens that causes an environmental impact. We need to think about what might happen, think about how we're going to respond, and then be able to actually carry out that response. And the way we make sure that it works is shown further down, which is periodic testing of this planned response. The usual one that we see for most people is some degree of spill response. People have spill kits around the site if there is sufficient, shall we say, risk of maybe oil spills or chemical spills. So we think about how we're going to to test that? Do we need to have some planned spill tests? We have fire drills. Do we need spill drills? We need to make sure that the training, the competence of people that might be expected to respond. Do we have a spill response team? We have fire response teams usually. We have first aiders. Do we need a spill response team? If we do, what training do they need? What competence do we expect of them? How do we test that they're ready for action? We need to provide information on how we might expect people to respond. And we need to, if we do have an accident, we do have an incident, we then need to evaluate sort of post-emergency, what's happened, what went wrong, how can we improve, how can we try and stop that happening again. Monitoring, measurement, evaluation, this is now back to a facilitation clause. Is the stuff that we're doing under operational control, is it effective? We need to monitor, measure, analyse and evaluate our environmental performance, including the management system itself. We think about what do we need to monitor? How are we going to monitor? What methods are we going to use? Do we need to have calibrated equipment? So if, for instance, one of our permits says we can only put things down the drain with a set pH, so it's usually between 6 and 10, what equipment are we using to monitor that? Does that equipment need to be calibrated? The pH meter, does it have to be calibrated? And again, quite often the permit will tell you whether it needs to be calibrated or not. What is the criteria we're going to use? If it's pH, what does the permit tell us? Yes, it's to be between 6 and 10. So what is that criteria? What are the appropriate indicators? How are we going to perform the monitoring? When is it going to be done? Sticking with pH monitoring and effluent, quite often that's a continuous flow, continual flow. No, continuous is the best word there. Continuous flow, flowing all the time. So we would probably monitor on an ongoing basis. If we're monitoring emissions going up our stack, up our chimney, we might only have to monitor at certain times. I have a particular client that has to particularly monitor when the wind speed drops below a certain level, because if there's no wind, then what does go up the chimney doesn't get dispersed. So they have to monitor, they have to do additional monitoring if the wind speed drops below a certain meters per second. So we need to think about all of this, take it all into account. How are we going to analyse the results? Who's going to do that analysation? And then communicate the results internally and externally as required. So the external communication for monitoring would normally be to the regulator. So in the UK, it would be either the Environment Agency, the local authority, maybe SEPA if you're in Scotland, or if you're in Wales, the Natural Resources Wales. Tied in with compliance, with legislation and our compliance requirements, we have to evaluate our conformity. So again, we need to think about how are we going to evaluate whether we're complying with the requirements placed upon us. How often are we going to check that? Who's going to do it? How are we going to do it? What methods are we going to use? The standard required, we maintain knowledge of our compliance status. So during an assessment, I might say, how are you doing with compliance against a particular piece of legislation? I would expect the business to be able to tell me, not to have lots of scratching of heads and oh, I don't know really, we're not sure about that. I don't know really, it's a while since we looked at that. The standard requires that you maintain knowledge of your compliance status across all of the mandatory and voluntary compliance obligations. Records need to be retained. And this is something that this final bullet point is something that I take quite seriously and ask our assessors to do. A non-compliance is not necessarily elevated to a non-conformance. That's within our audit, within an external assessment, if it's been identified and is being corrected within the scope of the system. So if I find something that's in breach of regulation, in breach of a piece of legislation, if I say, oh, that doesn't appear right, that's in breach of such and such a piece of regulation, and the company go, yeah, we know, we've identified it, and when we get back into the office, we'll show you what we're doing about it, I would not raise that as a non-conformance because the management system's working. It's been identified and action's been taken. If the answer is, oh, we never realised that, oh, crikey, what we're going to do now? that would get raised as a non-conformance. So, you know, don't try and hide things from your assessor. If you find you're doing something wrong, use your system to put it right. That's what the system's there for. Don't try and sweep it under the carpet and hope we don't notice. If you find something's not working, identify it, correct it within the management system. That's what the management system's there for. Hopefully, your internal audits will identify where things are not happening correctly. And the evaluation of compliance in a lot of business is part of the internal audit. But it's if you like, it's a special internal audit that instead of evaluating compliance with the system, is evaluating compliance with the legislation or the other requirements placed upon you. This is a fairly standard clause across all of the different standards. We need to carry out internal auditing. We need to have an audit program. We need to consider that audit program is risk-based, so that the areas where we present the greatest risk to the environment, we would expect to see checked a little bit more often. Management review, last couple of clauses. This is where senior management, if you like, take a step back. I liken it a little bit to an organisation having an annual general meeting. We're looking at, or we're expecting to see the organisation looking at the big picture. Taking a step back, I used to work for an environmental charity called Groundwork, and my director, I used to run the 14,001 system with that organisation. Every time we had a management review, my director would always say, remember, Richard, we're up in the helicopter now. We want the helicopter view. We don't want detail. We want to see the big picture. We want to look at trends. And that's basically what this is all about. The standard requires inputs and outputs, and I've listed them there. And I'm not going to go through them because you're quite capable, I hope, of reading what's in there. But remember, management review is a process. I still see people, I hear people talking about a management review meeting. It might involve a meeting, it might involve people sitting around the table, but that is part of a wider process called the management review. And finally, continual improvement. Note the word continual improvement. So it's about finding out from the monitoring and measurement we've done in clause 9. What do we need to improve? Where can we be better? What things have we identified that are wrong? What areas need to be sorted out? It's about improving the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the system and focusing on environmental performance improvement. Going back to, if you like, the key outputs of the standard, the system. Achieving the intended outcomes. Making sure we're reducing adverse environmental impacts and increasing the beneficial impacts of what we're doing. How successful are we at doing that, and where can we do better? That's what the standard is all about. And the middle clause, clause 10.2, is about non-conformity and corrective action. If we find something wrong, we need to take a graded approach. I'm not going to say where I was yesterday, but the business I was auditing yesterday didn't have a graded approach. Every single finding coming out of an audit was treated at exactly the same level. And they didn't get a well, actually they did get a non-conformance because there was something, another wider issue. But one of the things we were saying to them was, you need to take actions dependent upon the significance of what you found. When we do our environmental assessments, when we do our 14,001 audits, there's 3 levels of findings. There's major non-conformances, there's minor non-conformances, and opportunities for improvement. We take a graded approach. We expect you to take a graded approach as well. And that's more or less it. 14,001, is it the end of the road? Or is it the first step in a longer journey? Obviously, you can look at 50,001, there's an energy management standard, or you could look at, as an increasing number of our clients are doing now, you can look at carbon neutrality. When you get the link to this this webinar, it will be a link to our YouTube channel. there are a number of webinars that I've done and others have done, but I've done particularly around those other two standards, 50,001 and PAS 2060, in terms of carbon neutrality. I would strongly suggest, if you have an interest in those, you have a look at those. Right, so I think that is as far as we're going in terms of the presentations. What I'm now going to do is to work my way through the questions that we haven't already covered. If you wish to leave, now would be a good time to leave, because obviously I've said everything I'm going to say about the presentation, or you're welcome to stop and listen to the questions. We are going to take probably another 5 minutes to look at those. So the first one that was asked was from Naima. Hello, Richard. I would appreciate if you could please clarify, who does zero carbon legislation apply to? So I'm not quite sure what legislation you're talking about, because at the moment, I'm in the UK, there is no formal legislation that requires anybody other than the government to achieve zero carbon. In the UK, the government have set legally binding targets for net zero by, I can't remember, is it 2050? I ought to know, but off the top of my head, I can't remember. As a business, there are no legally binding targets in the UK, and I don't know whether you're in the UK or not, Naima. However, those zero carbon, net zero, carbon neutrality, call it what you will, and they all have slightly different meanings. They can apply to absolutely anybody. And one of the standards that I mentioned in the previous slide was PAS 2060, which is a way of demonstrating through a third-party assessment that you as a business are carbon neutral. That standard is designed to be, it can be used by the largest organizations anywhere. Multinationals can and do use it, and individuals can use it. I've seen people take the requirements of PAS 2060 and apply it to their own individual lifestyle. There are no, certainly that I'm aware of, there are no formal legally required zero carbon requirements, other than certainly in the UK if you are in national government. So I can't really answer any more than that at the moment. The next one is a long question, which I'm going to read out from Sean. Might be one for the end, I think it is. On the EMS risk and operations register, I've highlighted if the impact is positive, negative or neutral. Where there is a negative impact, I have put in an action to be taken going forward, and if possible on the neutral and positive, where applicable, I have a column for opportunities, potential benefits. Can I check, is this something that would benefit my EMS, or am I causing myself too much information? No, I think what you're doing there is absolutely spot on, Sean. And that is what I would look for as good practice in terms of meeting the requirements of clause 6.1. So making sure that in your risk and opportunities register, correct, identify whether it's positive, negative. Not everybody looks at neutral. Some people do. I would perhaps argue if it's neutral, it's neither one nor the other, so you can forget it. But if you want to include neutral, that's fine. I think what you're doing there is absolutely spot on, and I think that that is good practice. And I don't think you're causing yourself too much trouble, creating too much information. I think what you're doing there is adding value to your system and actually meeting the requirements of the standard. So I hope that that's answered that question. We've answered the one on interested parties. We've answered the one on relevant legal requirements. Physical boundaries, organisations based on home working. Again, I could talk on this all morning. It's an interesting one, because you're right, working from home has in some respects extended the boundaries of the physical boundaries of the organisation. Obviously, there are health and safety implications of people working from home, but that's another story. And indeed, from an environmental perspective, and I'll take environment on its own at the moment, it doesn't pose too many problems. There were energy issues, and we think about that in ISO 50001. And if you are looking at carbon management, because obviously moving an employee from your office to working from home, they are using energy in their house. Are you identifying and counting for the carbon that they're using when they sit at home with the heating on and running IT, running computers, printers, and all sorts of other stuff? As I understand it, if you are a business that has to comply with SECR, which is carbon reporting as part of your company reporting, you do not have to include home working in terms of the carbon emissions. But you're right, I would expect some degree of investigation, some degree of taking into account, thinking about the wording that the standard uses, to look at how home working is involved within the MS. So yes, it wouldn't expand the scope of the system, but I would expect to see in your monitoring and measurement some attempts to try and capture the outputs in terms of energy use, particularly from home working. Right, are environmental impacts determined by the environmental aspects and issues that can affect the goals of the management system? For example, will the opportunities to implement technology to reduce emissions be an environmental impact? Now, one of the questions I get asked often is what's the positive impact and what's the negative impact? So some people will say to me, is recycling a positive impact? Is using technology to improve something a positive impact? And I will always say, no, it isn't. It's a mitigation on a negative impact, and it's making a negative impact less negative. So recycling is still generating waste, but what you're doing is you're reducing the impact of that waste. You're not making it positive. And I think that is the crux of what we're saying here, that using opportunities to implement technology to reduce emissions, it's not the impact itself, but it's think about what it's reducing, but it's still a negative impact. It's not a positive. You're using technology to improve your a negative environmental impact. And I don't know whether that's answers any more than that. Can I add a link to the government report on 14,001 and 50,001? Yeah, and it also covers ESOS and SECR as well. Can you not cover off resources in 7? Yeah, you can. I tend to see in my presentations, technically it is in clause 7, it's clause 7.1. I tend to cover resources in leadership because at the end of the day, it's the leaders that provide the resources. Can an organisation implementing a 14,001 without seeking accreditation? Yes, you can. You can self-declare. You can say, yes, we work to ISO 14001 principles. But you can't, at the end of the day, without having that external verification, some people would say it's not worth the paper it's written on. But therefore, you can, and you can self-declare, and the standard does allow that. I think we've covered off the shift from home-based, office-based to home working. Does the standard cover the impact of home working? I think I've answered that, Simon. I take this includes international legal compliances shipping to or abroad. That's another one from Edward. Yes, it does. So if you are shipping abroad and there are particular issues around the product that you're shipping and the product might have to meet overseas environmental legislation, then yes, it does include that. Would an objective be down to scope and size of business? For example, one of our objectives would be to reduce our minimum energy requirement when the company is ticking over through the night, but this could be a 5-year project, so it'll be on the cards for a while. Yes, one of the things about objectives is are you talking about absolute usage, or are you talking about what the energy management standard talks about, energy intensity? So you might talk about, for instance, something about the amount of energy it takes to produce a component. I've seen people talk about that. The company I was with yesterday, a warehousing company, they look at kilowatt hours per pallet movement. So there's all sorts of things around how you manage energy and the types of things that you can report on. Gosh, Sean, you have a lot of questions. Would we be marked down if we have little response due to most people working from home? Tests will be done, but we have to consider a small company. Yes, you wouldn't be marked down. Usually, if we find that people are not taking into account home working, to start with, we would raise an opportunity for improvement and suggest that you might like to consider looking at home working, but you wouldn't lose your certification. How long should you have been monitoring to demonstrate compliance? I don't know really. Obviously, it's an ongoing process, and normally we would count ground zero, if you like, as when you achieve your first certification. If you're going for certification, we would expect to be able to demonstrate compliance going back a year. Is the Environmental Risk Register the register of significant aspects? No, it's not. The Environmental Risk Register, and I thought I'd made that clear at the start, the Environmental Risk Register is what's required in clause 611, which takes into account the context. The Aspects Register is completely different. The Aspects Register is what you do that has an impact on the environment. What is it that you're doing that changes the environment in some way? Is it air pollution? Is it water pollution? Are you producing waste? The Environmental Risk Register is what you've identified under context. When's the next standards going to be reviewed for new version? I don't know. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Fair one. Okay. I've got to go. I've gone for an hour and a half now and have another meeting at 12:30. So thank you very much. Apologise that I've gone on for a long time. Actually, we've still got about 3/4 of the people who started out an hour and a half ago. So thank you very much. What I am going to do is I'm going to give you my email address for those that are left. You can respond to the email that you will get over the possibly either later this week or maybe early next week, which will send out details of the recording and the copy of the slides. But my personal email address or work email address is richard.walsh, W-A-L-S-H, @nqa.com, richard.walsh@nqa.com. I don't mind if you want to send me an email to ask me a further question. I can't guarantee to respond within 24 hours because obviously I'm out auditing a lot of the time, but I will try and get back to you as best I can. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sitting through all of this. Hope you found it informing. Hope it's maybe giving you a bit of a fresh look at what 14,000 is all about, and keep in touch. And I would highly recommend you have a look at our YouTube channel and look at some of the other webinars that I've done and other members of our staff have done on a wide range of standards. Thank you very much, and hopefully catch up with you all again sometime.